Hey, so we're talking about social welfare policy today. As I was working on my slides yesterday evening, it occurred to me, I should really do the economic policy first. But at that point, I was 3 hours there. So we're sticking with what the silver says, and we're starting with social welfare policy. You guys, look, 3 weeks from right now, you will be completely done. I will still be grading, they will still be grading, but you will be all done, right? So all you have to do is hang on. All right, you can do this. You can do this. There are also resources if you're feeling like you're at the end. Right? So contact me, talk to your fellow, go to Goddard and say, hey, I think I'm having a mental health issue. They'll say, yeah, welcome to college. And so the point is, there are resources for you that the person do. Right? But get help from you. Okay. All right. So there are different types of policy. Economic policy, like I said, we're going to talk about that on Wednesday. We're going to talk about benefits, taxation, and budget, the fiscal policy. Okay. Monetary policy are things like interest rates. Why do we have interest rates setting? Any ideas? Something going on with the economy right now? Inflation, right? Okay. So inflation has been going down. So if you continue to raise interest rates, that is not good. Okay. So, but the Fed in charge of that, that's monetary policy. Social welfare policy, we're going to talk about today, education, poverty aid, health, veterans, old age care, children, all of that. Okay. Infrastructure policy, a lot of you just wrote policy papers. Some of them had to do with infrastructure actually. When we talk about infrastructure, it was pointed out in the last class, Adams Hall was built by the WPA, right? So when we talk about what infrastructure is, why do we have buildings like this at a university? Infrastructure, why do we have it? What's important? Accessibility, right? It's a big part of it, right? So when the University of Oklahoma burned down after a couple of years, there was a professor who said, hey, as long as I have a chalkboard and a piece of chalk, class can continue. Okay, I know you guys feel the same way. If this room was not here, you would totally be hanging on by every word in an outdoor forum as long as I had chalkboard and chalk, right? Yeah. One time. Okay. So there's a reason for it. Environmental policy. Because at the end of this group of slides, I will not get to it today. I know this already. And then immigration policy, which you guys spend a lot of time on in your labs, right? Probably more time than Congress has spent so far this year. So, so what is social welfare? Well, social welfare is when the government provides benefits to individuals to benefit society. Okay? All right. So we have some roots and precedents in this in our colonial roots. You know, there were towns. What's an example of where, for example, a town government would use social welfare to help someone in their midst? Why am I saying that? Okay. Because their house is part of the town? Okay, it's part of the town history. So, but thinking back, thinking about, you know, a colonial settlement or whatever, what is something that might precipitate the town as a whole helping a person? Rolling this together? Okay, is that the community? What? Tornado damage, yeah, absolutely. Tornado damage, so there's maybe a storm that damages, let's say, so people come together to try to provide shelter. What are some other examples? In my, 1700s example, what sort of economy do we have for the most part? Agrarian, thank you very much. So we had an agrarian economy. And so who was responsible for doing things like going into the fields and raising and, harvesting the crops? Who did that in the family? The man, right? And so that would mean that if something were to happen to him, right, what did the woman do? Did she then go into the fields? In society at that time? No, right? And she might have had like 4 children at the same time too. And so you might have town elders say, okay, so we have a widow, right? Or someone who's been injured, and so we're going to provide support to make sure that they don't go under. These are examples in colonial history. The Declaration of Independence also gives some indication that we believe in social welfare as a government job. In particular, I told you guys at the beginning of the class about happiness. What is happiness again in 1776? Not property. What is happiness in 1776? Fulfillment, being all that you can be. And so when we talk about things like social welfare, we're talking about creating structures and opportunities so that people can do what? Live up to their potential, right? I mean, that's part of it, living up to their potential. The preamble of the Constitution says that the government is established to provide for the general welfare of the people. And then, because we have separation of church and state in the Constitution and in the First Amendment, right? That means that when we were in, a lot of the ideas come from England or come from Europe generally, where the church and the state were what? The same thing. And so the church as an arm of the state often did things like provide hospitals, care for the sick, take care of the poor, right? In this separation, it also implies that there's a role for government in these things that was being carried out by churches. Okay, so we're going to talk about 2 different definitions: entitlement versus means-tested programs. Entitlement programs are government benefits that certain qualified individuals get regardless of their need for those things. So if I am 5 years old, what is a government program that I am entitled to regardless of need? What is something I'm entitled to as a 5-year-old? Here in the United States, what am I entitled to? I'm 5. Education, right? I'm entitled to K through 12 education. And we're talking about, this is mainly a state social welfare program, right? Nonetheless, because I am 5, I am entitled. Because I am 16, I'm entitled. If you are in college, what are you entitled to? Just by being in college. Sometimes it's part of your fee, right? But what? You're not, so we will talk about that. But one thing you're entitled to are subsidized student loans. The federal government, if you are enrolled in college, no matter if you need the money or not, you have a right to get student loans that are subsidized in terms of the interest payments. Okay, whenever I went to law school, I went to law school with this guy named Ron. Ron's dad had a tremendous amount of money and paid for him to go to law school, but Ron took out the maximum amount of subsidized student loans anyway. This was the 90s. Ron was much smarter with money than I was, and he took this money and he invested it in the stock market, and he pulled it out 6 months after we had graduated, paid off all the student loans, and had $100,000 to start his practice of law. Where do you get that money? Because the government paid for his interest. right? Did Ron need that money? No. It's an entitlement, right? My mother is 75 years old. What is she entitled to? Social Security and Medicare, okay? Both of those things. These are entitlements. Because she worked and paid in the system and she reached a certain age, she is entitled whether she needs it or not, right? So if she's a millionaire, billionaire, it doesn't matter. She still gets Social Security check, okay? Means testing programs are different. These are government programs. These are government programs that are only available to individuals who fall below a particular poverty line, okay? And these are shifting poverty lines. It depends on the program, right? So for children's health insurance, for example, the poverty line is actually higher. Parents who maybe make enough money that they do not qualify for, say, SNAP benefits or something like that, a means tested program, still would qualify for the children to get health insurance, okay? These poverty lines differ from program to program, but they're means tested. In other words, you have to show that there is a need. Pell Grants are an example of a needs test, a means tested, a program where you have to show that you have a need. Means tested gets about 15% of the total budget, whereas entitlement programs get about 45% of the total budget. But entitlement programs are much more popular. And they're much more popular because everybody gets them. Okay? So people don't say, well, I work hard. It's not fair that I don't get it because I work hard. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. And we're going to talk about work in just a second. But the war on poverty that started under LBJ in the 1960s becomes the war on poverty programs under the Reagan administration in the 1980s, where they slowly get dissolved or reduced. So policies provide benefits to individuals. These are social welfare policies. They include things like your education. If you get an education and it is paid for by the government, right, you're all entitled to it. Nonetheless, it is your high school diploma. Nonetheless, it is your college degree, right? It's an individual benefit. It's an individual benefit. Social Security is an individual benefit. You don't have to go down and do something in a community to do that. The Social Security check shows up. The Medicare check shows up. Okay? When we talk about poverty, then we're talking about means tested programs. Okay? And you get an individual benefit. Healthcare is an individual benefit. You go to see a doctor, the healthcare is for you. Veterans also individual benefits. My husband, former Marine, because of that, he gets VA benefits, but guess what? So do I, because I married him, right? And so, yay, that's good. And that means that, you know, there are these benefits that he gets. So, for example, we get a house with virtually no down payment. We get super low interest rates. He can go to the VA for healthcare if he needs to. Okay, all of these things. The largest federal social welfare policy, Social Security and Medicare, 90% of Americans approve. They are super popular. The majority of social welfare recipients are not poor. The majority of social welfare policy recipients are not poor. So most of the money is going to go to entitlement programs where people get it regardless of their income and wealth. So let's talk about education. Education is mainly an entitlement. K through 12 is going to be an entitlement that is primarily through the state. So state constitutions like the Oklahoma Constitution says you shall establish a system of education. Okay? And so there's a really clear state policy, set of state policies to establish these social welfare entitlement programs. The federal government does do some things to help, however. And so some of the things that they do is they provide standards for course material, they mandate days spent in school, they provide funding, they require adequate yearly progress, and they grade districts on performance. Now, what's important about this is it's not a federal government standard. It's a state standard. States set their own standards, and then the federal government gives funding based upon the state's standards. Okay? They also do things like free breakfast and lunch. Do you know what the #1 indicator of or the very best way to increase test scores among children is? Literally, free breakfast and lunch. Because you know what? Protein makes your brain work. Okay? Not starving, not thinking about how hungry you are means you can concentrate on what's going on in school. Right? You guys all ate lunch before this. Now you're a little sleepy because you ate a little bit too much bread. It's okay. I do. Thank you. But state and federal level policy control, both, they're going to go back and forth, but states have the most control over policy. There are two subsets of ed policy. There's higher ed policy and common ed policy. So higher ed policy, here at the University of Oklahoma, you guys pointed out, hey, we're having to pay for this. Not so much, okay? The state of Oklahoma, at the University of Oklahoma, pays for around 11 to 13% of our total operating costs. So through taxes that we pay as citizens that come to the university, 11 to 13% comes from the state. About another 15 to 20% comes from tuition and fees. That leaves a lot left. That leaves like almost 70%. Where does that money come from? Who can tell me? At this public university. Where does the money come from to keep the lights on? Partially the federal government, grants in particular, but also donors. So private donors, the federal government, that's where the money comes from. And so colleges, universities, because they want to, keep going, then they have to also abide by federal policies. There have been 4 major common ed policies that we have seen in the United States, right? So we have #1, the National Defense Education Act, that's from 1959 or 58, sorry. And why did we do that? National Defense Education, that seems weird. Why is the Department of Defense interested in our education? 1958, want to go ahead and do it? Cold War, absolutely, right? Sputnik is in the air. We're falling behind in math and science. They said, we need smarter people. Let's teach them math and science, okay? And so that's what we get. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 is more comprehensive. We see a lot more stuff like they say, oh, and they're beating us at gymnastics. And so therefore we need to have PE. They say, oh, we also need to be able to have an understanding of humanities and how to negotiate and how to think critically. And so we get the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, in which the federal government sets out some broad guidelines, and they're super broad, and say, states, educate your people. Here's some money. These are some ideas. Give it a shot, right? And some states do well, and some states do less well. And if you take my state government class, I'll tell you which ones do better than others. But there's some floundering that goes on, right? And so in the late 1990s, Texas says, hey, George W. Bush is governor, a Republican. There are Democrats who are controlling the legislature, and they say, let's figure out a way to improve education in Texas. And so in Texas, they passed No Child Left Behind, right? And the idea behind No Child Left Behind is essentially this. I take a test, right? in my classroom. You all take tests in your classroom, and if our school as a whole gets above a certain threshold, then they say, great, here's your money for next year, continue what you're doing, right? If we fall behind in an area, they say, oh, this is a problem, you guys need to improve. We're gonna send tutors and give you a little bit more money. That seems like a good idea, right? But if you fall behind 2 years in a row, then the amount of money decreases, tutors stay about the same, or extra sort of teaching aids stay the same. But if you fall behind 3 years in a row, what happens? They take your money. They take the funding for your school, and they start sending your students to other places. So it looks like it's a great success in Texas. And so George W. Bush comes in as a Republican president, and he says, hey, I have a great idea, this bipartisan in nature. This really worked in Texas. Look, our scores are up. We have failing schools that have turned into amazing schools. So why don't we do this at a national level? Democrats in Congress said, that's awesome. We love education. Republicans in Congress said, this is awesome. It's a Republican plan. And they said, let's work together, and they did. And they passed No Child Left Behind. And so they send it out to the states, and states are like, yeah, so were you going to pay for the testing? And they're like, no, you're going to pay for the testing. They said, so how exactly are we supposed to be teaching this? And they're like, well, you know, they need to do this to get this funding. Meanwhile, in Texas, it turns out Texas has been cooking the books, right? In these school districts, people were afraid of doing what? Losing funding. And so they would transfer problem students out just as the term ended, so that they were not even registered as part of it. So it's kind of a problem. So No Child Left Behind had some problems too, in that there was a tremendous amount of teaching student tests. Not only that, the school districts like Moore next door actually contracted with other testing places because they would give them money to contract with them, right? And so they would give like 3 tests a year. The students were constantly taking these really high stakes tests. People didn't like that, right? Well, and let me tell you why. In the 1970s and 80s, whenever I was in school, as I pointed out many times to you guys, I'm a learner, okay? So we would have once a year tests. And these tests, for me, were awesome. I love it, right? I got to sit there, fill in little bitty circles with pencils, like perfectly. You know, it was a contest, see if you could be done the fastest, see if you could get the right answers in those, right? We love that too. It was awesome. I loved it. And guess what? They meant absolutely nothing. At the end of the year, we get those scores back, and teachers would be like, hey, good job. And my parents would be like, yeah, that looks about right. And that was it. Right? There was no pressure. It was just a standard. This is how we're doing. Right? It looks like this student needs more help in reading. It looks like this student needs more help in math. With No Child Left Behind, this changes, and the pressure becomes bigger and bigger on both teachers and on students. So students start getting test anxiety. Parents start freaking out, and they say, hey, we've got to do something about this. Let's do something about this. We need to teach in a different way. And so the federal government says, okay, so here's some ideas. Why don't you guys look at these different curriculum states and put some in place that might help you, right? One of them that was very popular was called Common Core. You guys know what that is? You're nodding your head because you know?
I didn't know it.
Okay, so what's the problem with Common Core? Okay, why do you
Playing around and so that.
So there were some problems with Common Core, and one of the problems with Common Core actually is that they taught things in a different way, right? And so parents would sit down with their children who are 8 years old and not understand how to do the math. And so they were very upset about this. They were like, wait, has math changed? How does math change? This is ridiculous. And so they got really upset. And so in places like, for example, Oklahoma, where Oklahoma adopted Common Core standards, they were not imposed upon Oklahoma by the federal government. The legislature and the governor said, hey, we're getting rid of Common Core because our parents hate it, and they did. They got rid of it completely. And the federal government said, hey, that's cool, but you know that if you don't have anything in place, we're not going to give you any money at all. So one of those things to remember about politics is this, right? Is that you have to think about the consequence. So a different plan, cool. But just getting rid of a plan without having another plan is problematic. Okay? So in 2015, they passed the Every Student Succeeds Act. This was meant to be less pressure on the testing, less punitive. There's still a lot of tests, right? How many of you took at least a test a year, if not 2 tests a year that were the high-stakes tests? And that's just, I look at it and I'm like, I am so sorry. I do not have to do that. That's wrong. So, but the idea is this, and I want to tell you guys, if any of you are education majors or going into policy, what my specific experience is with these types of programs. After I finished law school, I went to Kyrgyzstan to teach at a college. And whenever I was teaching in Kyrgyzstan, I had 2 groups of students. This is 1997, so the Soviet Union's only fallen about 4 years, right? But I had 2 groups of students. I had students that went to school A and students that went to school B. And school A was a Soviet-style school where they memorized the same test every year. They would memorize the test itself and then go take the test. Okay? School B was a school that was innovative, critical thinking. Okay? And so with my students, who were all bright, okay? They were all bright. But school B students could do what I needed them to do, which was think. And school A students couldn't. So for example, I gave a hypothetical that was, an international law scenario, and I made up a country and I called it Brasilia, right? Which sounds a lot like Brazil. Okay? And so I made up this hypothetical, and hey, who's responsible, who owes who what, under what law? These are my questions, right? I'm sure you guys would love to take that. I'll look for the questions. But I had students from school B who were able to look at the questions and answer and think in a way that made sense, right? And they sat before me in 1997, so there was no internet, they weren't leaving the room, they were right there from taking this exam. But I had students from school A who were sitting in the same spot could not even understand what I was asking with the question. However, one of the students' answers really stands out to me. He sees Brasilia and she goes, Brazil is a luxury country whose primary import and exports are, and she goes on for 2 pages with basically an encyclopedic memorized knowledge of Brazil. It's not that she's not intelligent. It's just that her brain can't do what? Can't look and make decisions in a critical way. And so when we talk about education, when we talk about the way to be educated, we have choices. So, Social Security is an entitlement. With entitlements, right? The great thing about them are if you have paid into Social Security, how many of you have ever had a job where Social Security takes money out of your check? I get a letter every year saying, this is how much money you currently have in Social Security. And I think that's nice. Social Security was created to do a particular thing. In 1935, in the height of the Great Depression, the most vulnerable people were the elderly. They were unable to work. The average life expectancy was 65. And there was no one to care for them. And so the idea behind Social Security was that there would be a safety net. Safety net. Right? My great-grandfather meant, my great-grandmother meant, lived in the hills of Arkansas, and they were hunter-gatherers, or great-grandfather was a hunter-gatherer. They enjoyed snuff quite a bit, ate floral grains when possible, and this is how they lived their life, right? But in the 1960s, my great-grandfather was, old. And he couldn't do the same things he had done before. And so my grandfather Huckabee went to the Social Security office and paid in enough for him to retire. He paid in enough for him to retire. And so from then on, for the next several years of his life, he's able to draw Social Security tax. Employers and employees both contribute to Social Security, which means this: they take something out of your check, they take the same amount that your employer pays the same amount over yours into that. Another example of this that comes out is unemployment. Okay, unemployment insurance, you pay into it, but so does your employer. Okay, so when they have to pay unemployment because they fire you or they lay you off, then they're paying out of what they have paid in part. The trust fund is used to pay benefits and the loan money to the government. Beginning with the Vietnam War, we said, hey, there's all this money over here. Let's give ourselves some of it and go find more. And we were like, that's and they're like, it's fine, it's fine. And so we start getting a national debt. Okay, just bigger than ever before. We see it explode in the 1980s under the escalation of nuclear arms under Ronald Reagan. But what that means is that the trust fund gets somewhat depleted. The last 3 years of the Clinton administration, remember you guys, I showed you this video, you can watch Bill Clinton saying, hey, we should raise taxes. And people went, yeah, no, you totally should. And he did. Well, the last 3 years we had a surplus, and he said, hey, let's pay back the Social Security fund after the $1,000 I gave. He said, when I get elected, that's what I'll do. People said, I will take my $153 check. And that's what he did. The ratio of workers to beneficiaries is narrowing. The boomers were a giant generation, and they're all retired. And they're going to live forever, because of all the health care and benefits that they have. Which means you and me, for a while, are going to pay for them. My mother thanks you for her check. Okay. The trust fund will be depleted unless we pay it back, unless we do something about it. So, one thing we also need to understand when we talk about poverty is income and wealth. Our income is the amount we make in a certain period of time, right? So I make this much a week, or this much a month, or this much a year, right? That's income that I take in. Wealth is all the stuff that I have due to my income, right? And maybe it's that I have a car, maybe it's that I have a house, or a piece of property, or I have some stocks and bonds, or I have some savings, right? That's wealth, right? So, I may have a high income, but if I spend it all, right? Like in Brewster's Millions, which you've never heard of before, then I won't have any wealth. But if I do things with it, I save it, or if I invest in things that keep their value, then I will build wealth over time. Make sense? This is an important lesson for you guys. Save, right? The key to a successful democratic process is a strong middle class. So let's see what's happening to ours. First of all, the top 400 wealthiest families in the United States today own an amount equal to the bottom 60% of households. 60% of households. Okay? The wait, the top 0.1% own as much as the bottom 80%. Look, if you are in the income or wealth category of about 78, 79%, then guess what? You're upper middle class and you're doing pretty well. Top 0.1% owns as much as the bottom 80 altogether. In addition to that, we have a problem. 50.4% of all working Americans, and I had this question in a previous class, I'm going to address it. This is looking at people who are not dependents, okay? So who are on their own working adults, okay? 50.4% are going to fall below the poverty line for at least a year in their lifetime. Half of us. That's 1/2 of us. Poverty is not an isolated small group. 11.5% of Americans live below the 2021 poverty line of 25,000 for a family of 4, 12,000 for one person. That's the poverty line. Low income and poor are going to take up about 43.5% of the population. And only 20% of these who live below the poverty line receive assistance from the federal government and state governments. SNAP, any other sort of assistance that would help them in terms of taking care of their family, paying rent, housing, all of those sort of things. Only 20%, 1 in 5. 1 in 5. Black and Hispanic Americans have much higher poverty rates than other groups. So the gray line, all races, the teal line, Asian, the navy line, white, not Hispanic. Black Americans are in the gold line, and Hispanic in that pretty blue line right there. And we can see, this is just 1990 to 2020, but the same trend exists since we started tracking it in 19. If we look in terms of child poverty rates in the OECD, what's the OECD? Anybody know? It's those countries that are the most economically developed in the world. Okay, and so usually when we talk about comparing ourselves, we're going to compare ourselves to those countries that are part of the larger trade cycle. Okay, so the United States, in terms of living in poverty rates, right down here at the bottom, there's Finland and Denmark and Iceland and I can't really read that one, and the Czech Republic. So these are the lower rates of poverty. At the top, we have Greece and Turkey, and I can't read very well. And then there's the United States at around number 9. We have really high poverty rates among the most developed countries in the world. One of these things that contributes is education. Getting back to education. We talk about wealth again. Highest level of educational attainment in households. Okay? If it is less than a high school degree, then the median net worth in 2020 is about $4,600. If there's a high school degree, look at that. 10-fold more, 41,000. If there's some college with no degree, 71,000, an associate's degree, 116,000, bachelor's degree, 233,000. This is me encouraging you to do well this study. Okay? Graduate or professional degree, 459. accumulated wealth. This is the network we need by. We're going to talk a little bit more about this. This is kind of a poverty measure that takes into account when government gives benefits and then also what expenses you have. So it's not just tax income. It's also some of these benefits that maybe will come in like SNAP or housing subsidies, low income. And so this is an idea of what is actually where people actually sit in terms of poverty. And we're going to come back to this a little bit when we talk about the economy. So we have some attitudes on poverty. Americans generally think that the government should help. But we also tend to believe that the poor are not trying hard enough. People should take personal responsibility for themselves is a common theme, and whites' attitudes are strongly influenced by their view of non-white people. In other words, if whites have an unfavorable or racist view of people who are not white, they are much more likely to think that government programs should not go to the poor. The media portrays 3/4 of welfare recipients as African American, but in fact, they're about 1/5 of recipients. The majority of welfare recipients are white. There's some opposing views on what causes poverty. This idea of a culture of poverty, negative attitudes and values towards work, family, and success that condemn people to lower levels of accomplishment. The idea that the poor are present-minded, lack self-control, exhibit poor work habits, lack positive aspirations, and have weak family structures and relationships. It's one way that can be argued for why we have poverty. Then another idea is this idea of hostile environment. That we have racial discrimination, social and cultural customs, and educational limits that keep people in a particular place. The primary link to disparity in income is unequal access to education. People are poor because of external barriers to their success. More work does not mean less poverty. We have more people in the workforce who work longer hours and has more poverty than every other of the G7. Unemployment insurance is an entitlement. So here's labor productivity. If you say, hey, that's okay, we should work more because then our GDP stays high. Well, it's more productive in Ireland or in Norway where they work 1,400 hours a year versus us at 1,780. As a matter of fact, in terms of average hours worked annually in the United States, it's 1,780, and that's higher than everybody except for Greece, South Korea, and Mexico. Among the OECD. Another part of social welfare is health. It's about 30% of our total budget. And about 7.5% of that is veterans in particular. 6% subsidies under ACA on the Affordable Care Act, 5.5%, or 0.5% goes to the CDC, the FDA, the USDA, all those regulatory agencies that try to keep us from being poisoned by our food and stop outbreaks. 21% go to children, and 15% go to Medicare. 50% of that goes to Medicare. So it's an entitlement. I'm 65. I get it. If we look at pandemics and our mortality rate in the United States, among developed nations, the U.S. mortality rate has been the highest for a while. It continues to be the highest, and COVID-19 further widened that gap. We rank second in amount of excess deaths caused by the pandemic. Okay? So between 2017, we can estimate about what proportion of our population should die every year based upon what's going to happen. 85.2 more people per 100,000 die. Second only to is the 19. But our mortality rate is still the highest. We're not gonna have time to talk about the environment, I promise.
No, that's fine. We're gonna get-
Not all about that. But, since 1962, Rachel Carson writes a book called Silent Spring, and this really brings our attention to it. In 1970, and this is the key thing I want you to take, 3/4 of our lakes and rivers were unfishable and undrinkable. 3/4. After the passage of the EPA, and standards that were put on corporations that were dumping into, for example, the Great Lakes in particular, we have one of the world's safest water supplies. 92% of water is safe, but there's still toxic. Obviously, in Jackson, Detroit, Michigan, we have recent problems in terms of the water supply. We also have issues with climate change and air quality, which we'll not. So I put this up in your quiz. Which social welfare policy do you think is most important? The code is social, all caps, SOCIAL, social. So which one of these do you think is most important? And this one we have the growth of government has been driven by the growth of social welfare policy, right? Beginning with the UDO. Thing is, Americans really like this policy. They want government to do more, but they want to pay less. So we're going to talk about taxes on Wednesday. And we're going to talk about the fact that the U.S. currently has the smallest social welfare system among all developed nations. And it is considerable unequal political participation in these programs. In other words, yes, those people are getting Social Security and Medicare. Okay, people are getting social welfare benefits at an entitlement program, and they're going to participate more than others who are in these programs. Until Wednesday, good morning.